Thanks, Don. Well, good morning, church. Good morning to the two of you. That's everyone else. It is now 9:26. The coffee should be kicking in. All right, just before we dive into the word today, I just want to give you a couple of update news items. This is sounding a little boomy to me down here, Bill. I don't know if it's anyone else, but... So the first one is, if you have been around Lakewood for many, many years, you will know the name Lisa Prinz. And I just wanted to let you know that Lisa passed away on September 30th down in Sydney, where she's been living for the last number of years, Sydney, BC, on Vancouver Island. There's going to be a celebration of life for Lisa held on October the 11th, which is not going to be streamed, but there will be a video made available afterwards. So if you'd like opportunity to see that, I'm sure Rochelle will be posting things. If not, I'm hoping to be in touch and be able to pass that on, so you can get in touch with me if you'd like to be able to see that later on. Also want to mention that this past Monday, we've been talking about this for a while, we had a special members meeting that we invited everyone to come to. It was a great time together on Monday as we talked about a building project that we're looking at doing in the coming weeks. And it passed, you'll be happy to know, unanimously. So we are going to be proceeding with an upgrade to our furnaces. All the furnaces in the building will be replaced so that hopefully they don't die at minus 30 when we're trying to have church together. And we're also adding air conditioning for summer. So that's going to be really nice. Hot water on demand for our kitchen and this side of the building, which will be great so we can do things better around dishes. And also running gas for gas stoves in our kitchen. So lots of big things are going to be happening, which is really exciting. Now, why I wanted to bring this up today to you is to let you know we're going to be moving ahead with that. So there'll be some renovations coming in the next couple months. But also because the way that we fund things, someone asked, well, how do we pay for this? Well, that's a great question. We pay for this by us paying for this. So that's how we pay for things in the church. And so I just want to let you know that in the coming weeks, we're going to be letting you know a few more details about costs with this and give you an opportunity to pledge towards this in addition to what you would normally do for giving. Because redirecting our Sunday morning regular giving for general fund to a building project is great, but then we don't pay staff. And that's kind of problematic for some of us. I mean, we could have furnaces and no sermons, but, whatever you like. Anyways, so we'll be letting you know. I know some of you might be thinking that's a great idea, especially how this one's starting off, Dave. At any rate, we'll be letting you know a little bit more details about that in the coming weeks and how you can be involved in helping to make that go forward. So thanks for your faithfulness in all you do to make what happens at Lakewood happen. This does not happen without volunteers, without time you invest, without funds that you give, which is a great example. Yesterday, we had a whole bunch of people show up to help clean up the church and the property around it. And you may have noticed how beautiful the landscaping actually looks around it today, like nicely mowed down. Thank you, Clayton, for going above and beyond, my friend. That was incredible, along with a whole team of people. So, thank you, church, for being invested in what God's doing here. All right, we are going to dive into the Word, and we are diving in fairly directly today. So this week and next week, we are going to be looking at two of the most iconic stories probably in all of Scripture, but particularly in this area of Scripture that we've been going through, which is called the Exodus, or as we've been calling it, our journey to freedom. And so we're going to be looking at the story of the 10 plagues that God sent on Egypt today. And then next week, we're going to look at the story that actually this picture is all about, with God parting the waters of the Red Sea to lead his people on dry ground through, to lead them in an escape away from Pharaoh and his army. But today, as we dive into this first story about the 10 plagues that God sent against Egypt to compel Pharaoh to let his people go, rather than focusing in on all the plagues themselves, because, there's 10 of them, and we could read the whole thing and talk about each of them and why they're significant, but what I want to do is ask the question, why? Why the plagues? Why does God use these dramatic circumstances to lead his people on this journey to freedom? And to get at the answer to that question, what we're going to do is actually just touch down a few times throughout the narrative. Now, if you want to read the whole thing, which I would encourage you to do, because it's a great, great story, you'll want to read all of Exodus 5 through 11. Okay, that's the chapters we're kind of touching down into today. But we're just going to touch down at a few moments where God speaks through Moses in order to get Pharaoh to let his people go. And we're going to see through these moments what God was really up to as he sent these 10 plagues on the nation of Egypt. So, if you have your Bibles here this morning, you can open up. We're going to start in Exodus chapter 5. I'll have it on the screen here for you as well to follow along if you would like. Exodus 5, 1 to 12. Afterwards, which is, after a whole bunch of calling story and everything that we read last week about Moses, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Then they said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword." Strike who? Israel. Interesting. But the king of Egypt said, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." And Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you're stopping them from working." That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. "You're no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota." They're lazy. That's why they're crying out, "Let us go and make a sacrifice to our God." Make the work harder for the people, so they will keep working and pay no attention to lies. When the slave drivers and overseers went out and said to the people, "This is what Pharaoh says, I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all." So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. Well, from this initial confrontation with Pharaoh, we see some hints of the things that are going to be coming throughout this story. Some key things that we're going to see play out over the following chapters. And I want to highlight 4 things for you that we pick up in this first opening confrontation. And the first one is that Israel is being called out of slavery in Egypt. But they're not being called out of slavery just so they can no longer be slaves. But they're actually being called to something else. God is calling them not just out from somewhere, but he's calling them into somewhere as well. Which really demonstrates the compassionate heart of God, which we're not going to read about today, but shows up throughout this story. You can read that all through. There's many times where God kind of expresses his compassion for his people. And we see that in him wanting to lead them out of this place where they're being oppressed and into a freedom and a joy that will be different. Now, the initial ask from God is that he wants them to go hold a festival to him in the wilderness. He wants to have his people come away for 3 days to be able to worship him. Which raises a question. Was God, and Moses being God's mouthpiece, being dishonest in this request? Because if you read the rest of the story, like if you know the end of this story, you know God actually wouldn't just be happy with Pharaoh letting his people go for 3 days and then they come back into Egypt to be slaves again. That's not God's end game. So in asking for Pharaoh to release them for these 3 days, is that a dishonest request? Knowing what he's actually wanting to do. Well, really, I think what's going on here is God's just starting with a pretty simple logical request. And Pharaoh's response to this first request says a lot about where he's coming from. Because Pharaoh's response to God is, "Who is Yahweh? Who is Yahweh that I should obey him?" Now, this is going to end up being a really important theme. We're going to pick this up a little bit later on. Because through the plagues and, this whole journey that Pharaoh is going to be going on through these 10 incredibly painful and difficult plagues, Pharaoh and everyone else is going to get to know that Yahweh is truly God. The third theme here is about Pharaoh's hard heart. Because here, like we said, we see his refusal even to a simple request that God makes through Moses. And just think about how simple and reasonable this request actually was. God's people have been enslaved in Egypt, working every single day for decades, for generations. And God's asking for them to get a 3-day weekend. For a people who have never had a break. For some people, they just had a 4-day weekend. That's not too bad for September, right? But you had another one in August, and one before that in July, 3-day weekend. And then, we have lots of times where we get time off. But even more than this being a reasonable request because they had never really had time off, it's even more reasonable because of really what ancient wisdom would say in this circumstance. Because here's the thing. The way that ancient cultures viewed deities is if you wanted to appease a deity to keep them from taking you out, you made sure you did what the deity asked, right? And so if God is asking for his people to go into the wilderness to do a 3-day festival, it would actually be in Pharaoh's best interest to allow them to go and do that. Even, Moses identifies this, if we don't go, God might strike us with plagues. Pharaoh, you might lose your workforce if you don't let us go, because our God might strike us down. According to what would be true in ancient wisdom, Pharaoh's would have been serving his own interest to let the people actually go so he could retain his workforce. But what we've already seen through this story as we've been digging into it is that that's not the kind of Pharaoh that this Pharaoh is. He is a tyrant. He is oppressive. He is the epitome of evil. And his total rejection of Yahweh as God and his unwillingness to waver are put into the spotlight in this story. Even in this little part, in this initial confrontation, we see Pharaoh acting like an abuser, don't we? By taking really what was his own problem, his own fault, and placing the blame instead on his victims. He's being called out for his oppression, and he says, actually, the problem is that people are lazy. That's the real problem here. That's textbook abuse. So that's the third thing, Pharaoh's hard heart. And we're going to come back to that idea of Pharaoh having this hard heart that gets harder still through the story. But the fourth thing, just to quickly highlight for you, is a hint that this is not going to go well for Pharaoh. There was a note at the end of that section that said the people scattered all over the land to go find stubble to use as straw for the bricks, right? Now, one of the things we like to talk about is hyperlinks in the Bible, right? These places where they connect to other stories. And we see this word scattered, and that should remind us of another story where things did not end up going well. If you can think about that, Genesis chapter 11, we refer to this one often, the Tower of Babel, which was a group of people who came together and they wanted to build a tower to reach up to the heavens so they could be like God, right? God came down, checked out their tower, which was incidentally made of brick. He came down, looked at their tower, said, yeah, that's not going to happen, and he scattered them to the ends of the earth and confused their language so they couldn't come together and build this tower. So when we see again this idea that the people were scattered all over the land, that should be a hint for us to go, oh, Pharaoh causing them, this is not going to go well for Pharaoh. Things are not going to end up good for him. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of these themes. We're going to explore them a little bit today, starting out with what God was doing for Israel. Now, Israel, in fairness, has a bit of a freak-out moment after this happens, because now that they have way more work to do and they're not given the straw anymore, they kind of panic and they freak out at Moses and say, what have you done for us? You should have never said anything to Pharaoh. This is a terrible idea. So they have their moment of panic, which, I think we can identify with, because sometimes when God's doing something in our life, but things get harder first, I don't know about you, but I can tend to panic. And I can tend to think, maybe this was a terrible idea and God's not actually doing what he said. But after they get through the panic, God sends another message through Moses to his people. And this is what he says. Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, which is the same to say, I am Yahweh, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. God reiterates his promise that he's going to bring Israel out from slavery. And he does it actually with a really unique phrase. It's not totally explicit here, but you catch the gist of it. He talks about he's going to free them with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. Now, in Deuteronomy, later on, looking back at this story, the phrase that comes up, and is used actually through a lot of scripture looking back at this event, is that God would use his outstretched arm and his mighty hand. A mighty hand and an outstretched arm is how he delivers his people out of Egypt. Now, why is that actually important? That phrase is actually taking a real shot at Pharaoh directly. Because for about 3,000 years, pharaohs were depicted as having a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, like on this picture here. It's called the Narmer palette, which was actually like a tray for like makeup and stuff, but this is the bottom, this is the back side of it. And you can see Pharaoh in the middle of that, and on the one hand, he's holding up his hand like this, an outstretched arm, and with his mighty hand, he's gripping the hair of the guy that he's going to take out in just a second. And this is how pharaohs were pictured, right? This is what they looked like. They had a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And God, coming to deliver his people with a mighty hand and outstretched arm, is taking a direct shot at Pharaoh, saying, you may think you're great, but I'm greater. And he's going to show him just how much greater he is. So, carrying on, verse 7 and 8, because God has more to say to his people. He says, I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. He's going to bring them out of slavery, but God is also going to bring them to something. And he reiterates his promise to take them to a land of their own. They've been living in the land of Egypt under oppression. God's going to take them to a land that will be theirs. And it'll be a rich, full land. And not only that, he's going to bring them into a covenant relationship with himself, where they are going to know God and be his people. It's not actually enough to God that he sets his people free from slavery in Egypt. He actually wants to lead them into a greater inheritance where they will know him and have a land of their own. But what about Pharaoh? Where's he at in this whole story? What's his experience like? Getting to know that Yahweh is God. Well, we're going to drop down in the story a little bit and read a little further into the story to see how he's doing. And as we catch up with him in chapter 9, life's not going so great for Pharaoh. He's already had a pretty terrible time. He has seen his nation go through awful challenges of their primary water supply being turned into blood. The land got covered with frogs, probably not as cute as the frog on the screen. And then they got covered with gnats or lice, and then flies. And then their cattle were wiped out due to plague. Do you like my dead cow up there? That's pretty great, right? And then the people have been afflicted with painful boils on their skin. Things are really, really not going well for Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. Now, interestingly, one of the interesting perspectives on the 10 plagues, there's a few different ways to view the plagues, and one of them is that it's a kind of uncreation story that God's doing in Egypt. In Genesis 1, when God created everything, what the story shows us is that God brought order out of chaos. At the very start of Genesis chapter 1, it talks about there was chaos, there was the waters, the deep, and the Spirit hovered over the surface of the waters, and then God starts to bring order to things, right? Bringing land and water separated, and then he separates light and dark, and he puts things on the land, plants and animals. And so there's actually, interestingly, this is one of those fun things you find out when you're digging into stuff. What they call Genesis 1 is the 10 divine utterances of God to bring about creation and to bring order from chaos. The 10 divine utterances. Does 10 sound like an important number? Because here we have 10 plagues that are ultimately bringing an incredible amount of disorder to Pharaoh's world. A world that he has carefully constructed to be under his control, whether through the gods of Egypt or through his own power being on display. He has brought order to his world that now God is completely upending. And in fact, there's some direct references to this creation versus uncreation kind of thing, like the one plague God sends where it becomes like this tangible darkness, even though it's daytime, which really is removing the barrier between night and day, where God makes everything dark again in Egypt. Pharaoh's world gets turned upside down. It is not going well for him. So we pick it up with Pharaoh again in Exodus chapter 9, just to see how he's doing. The Lord said to Moses, "Get up early in the morning, confront Pharaoh and say to him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says. Let my people go, so that they may worship me. Or this time I will send the full force of my plagues against you and against your officials and your people, so you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. For by now I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague that would have wiped you off the earth. But I've raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. You still set yourself against my people and will not let them go. Therefore, at this time tomorrow, I will send the worst hailstorm that has ever fallen on Egypt from the day it was founded till now. Give an order now to bring your livestock and everything you have in the field to a place of shelter, because the hail will fall on every person and animal that has not been brought in and is still out in the field, and they will die.' Those officials of Pharaoh who feared the word of the Lord hurried to bring their slaves and their livestock inside. But those who ignored the word of the Lord left their slaves and their livestock in the field." Guess how that went. So as God's sending all these plagues into Egypt, he tells Pharaoh that he's doing this so that they will know that Yahweh is truly God, that there is none like him in all of the earth. And not only are they going to know about it, not only are Pharaoh and his officials going to know about it, not only is Israel going to know that the Lord is God and there's none like him, but the whole world is going to hear about him as well. And actually, as we get further into the story, when Israel's heading into the promised land, we find out that the whole world has heard about this. They know what God has done for his people. Basically, what God's doing, though, in these plagues, is answering Pharaoh's question from their initial encounter. Who is the Lord that I should obey him? Well, here's who he is, Pharaoh. Now, some of Pharaoh's officials, they're starting to get on board with the fact that Yahweh is actually God, who is over all of their gods in Egypt, who is over all things on earth, who has power over everything. And they're starting to get the fact that they should listen to what he says. And so when this, and this is amazing. Did you notice God actually warns Pharaoh about the next plague? He does this consistently. He tells him what's coming. And he, in this case, he even says, listen, it's going to be so bad, make sure you get your livestock and people out of the fields, because it's not going to go well for them. And some of Pharaoh's officials actually heed the warning. And they go out and they bring in their livestock and their servants. But Pharaoh himself is still obstinate. He will not acknowledge Yahweh as God. And he has been on and continues on a trajectory from which there will be no return. As with the other plagues, after this hail hits and does incredible damage across the whole of Egypt, Pharaoh asks Moses again to pray. So God will relent, and if he does, then Pharaoh will let Israel go. So Moses prays, God relents, and Pharaoh lets people go. No, he doesn't. He changes his mind yet again, as he has done with every other plague. When he says he'll release Israel, he changes his mind and goes back on his promise. So, let's carry on in verse 34. When Pharaoh saw the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. Pharaoh hardens his heart, which is incidentally a theme we see throughout the plagues. This hardening of Pharaoh's heart. It actually sometimes happens with Pharaoh doing it himself. Sometimes God actually does it for him, which is a whole other conversation, which we're not going to dig into this morning. But what I wanted to highlight for you, actually, which is interesting, is that in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, there's actually two different words that speak to the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And in different parts through the plagues, one of them is used. In different parts, another one is used. The first word that gets used for the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is that it became more resolute. It became more steadfast, if you like, or persevering, which really could be a positive trait. You know, if you're going through a difficult time and your heart becomes more resolute, you're willing to persevere through that hard time. That can be a really good thing, right? We can get a lot done when we actually will persevere through something. However, if you're headed in the wrong direction and you keep making your heart more steadfast and persevering in the wrong direction, things are not going well for you. And that's where Pharaoh is going, where it turns this resolute heart into one that is just stubborn. Now, I am very familiar with stubbornness. It is a genetic trait in my family. We actually have a name for it. We call it the Dreger determination. So I am very well aware of this, and I have seen both the blessing when it's used well and the curse when it is not, and the train wreck throughout generations when it has not been used well. Now, Pharaoh resolutely is going his own way rather than the way of God, which kind of leads us to this other picture of what the hardening of his heart actually meant. The other way to think about it is not resolute, but that he had a heavy heart. Now, why is it a heavy heart? Well, this is something from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And this is a picture, it's kind of cool, actually. What this is doing is, someone is coming, final judgment, and their heart is actually being weighed. So on the scales that you see here, that's their heart. And on the other side is a feather. And the idea was, if your heart was heavier than the feather, then you were guilty of injustice. So the idea of a heavy heart is a guilty heart, a heart that is guilty of injustice. So really what's happening here is God, in a sense, is holding Pharaoh guilty by his own standards. Pharaoh has demonstrated that he is guilty of injustice, and God's saying, yeah. And he hardens his heart. Pharaoh hardens it, makes it heavier. He is more and more guilty of injustice as he goes down the road and will not let Israel go. Now, that hard heart is not just a Pharaoh problem. It's not just a Dave problem or a Dreger problem. This is a human problem. It's a very human problem. That we are stubborn. We want our own way in things. And generally, we're pretty resistant to someone else telling us how we should be or act. Would that be fair to say? We want to decide that on our own. So, as much as Pharaoh is not a good example, I think we can identify with him to some degree about where he's at in this. But God is showing Pharaoh consistently who he truly is, that he is truly the God over all things. And as he does that, Pharaoh becomes more and more resolute and guilty in his rejection of God and God's authority. And ultimately what God does is use Pharaoh's trajectory of evil and rebellion to lead him to his own destruction. Now, we're not going to talk about how this whole thing with the plagues ends today. We're going to pick that up next week as we look at the story of God leading his people out through the Red Sea. But what I want to note for us as we wrap this up today is that the story of the plagues against Egypt really become this archetypal or model story of how God confronts tyranny to rescue his people from slavery and lead them to something that is so much greater. And that's important because it's a story that Israel appealed to throughout their history when they were being oppressed by another nation, which happened often. Even before they went into exile, when they would face great enemies, they would appeal to this story and look for God's mighty hand and outstretched arm to deliver them. And this is a story that ultimately finds its fulfillment in the work of Jesus for us. Jesus came, being in very nature God, and faced off against an enemy, enduring temptation from that enemy, taking authority over evil spiritual powers in the world, and ultimately triumphing over them by letting them do their worst to him by executing him on a Roman cross. And through Jesus' triumph in that moment over the spiritual powers of the world, he has set us free from slavery to sin and death. And the reality for us as humans is we are all caught in that. We are all, like Israel, enslaved to that problem, enslaved to sin and death. We are all in need of rescue. And so as we look at this incredible story today, what can we take away from this story for us as we too walk into the journey of freedom with Jesus Christ? Well, I just want to note two things for us today as we think about that. The first one is that we are saved from slavery to sin and death for something else. We're freed from slavery to sin so that we can know God and live life according to his design for us. God has incredible compassion on us for the situation we find ourselves in, the situation of being enslaved in sin and death. And so he wants to bring us to freedom because he loves us. But he doesn't just lead us to freedom for freedom's sake. You know, one of the issues that we have, I think, in our culture today is we have a skewed perspective of freedom. In that we tend to think of freedom as autonomy. Freedom means I get to do whatever it is that I want to do. And that's actually not the kind of freedom God's provided for us. Because the problem with that kind of freedom is that what it ultimately leads to is us falling back into the same patterns of sin. You guys have seen the video with the sheep, right? I've shown it here before. You guys have seen the video of the sheep, right? The sheep that gets pulled out of the ditch by the guy, and then it gets free, and it leaps along the side of the ditch and then jumps right back in the ditch. And he's stuck just as bad as before. That is where freedom as autonomy leads us. We get set free from the power of sin and death, and if we think we just get to live our life for whatever end we want to live it, we just jump right back in the hole, and we're stuck again. God didn't just rescue us from slavery for no reason, but for a particular reason. He rescued his people Israel. He rescues us so we would know him, to be his people and enjoy our inheritance with him. Paul, writing about this many, many years, thousands of years later after the Exodus event, wrote these words to the church in Galatia. He said, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." Don't jump back in the ditch, church. It's a terrible idea. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. It's a command Jesus gave us. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and prophets are summed up in these two commands. So when we're set free, choose to use the freedom we have to pursue life with God, living according with its design, being, as we talked about last week, all in with him. So that's the first thing. We are saved from something, not just from something, but also to something, to a life that is lived in surrender to God. The second point, though, is that how we respond to God when he does these things actually matters. Pharaoh was dismissive of God. He resolutely continued to do things his own way, and it led him into greater evil and ultimately to his destruction. But when God shows up, he wants his people to surrender to him so that we would know him and so that we would follow him, because he knows that in him is truly life. And just like God had compassion on his people to lead them out of slavery in Egypt, he has compassion on us, wanting us to experience life instead of slavery to sin. But ultimately, our choice in what we do matters in this. So church, let's choose to continue on knowing God, searching him out and walking in his ways, so we don't fall back into the slavery we just got out of. Well, we're going to move our attention from digging into the Word into a time where we respond to God about what He's been saying to us through it. And I'll invite the teams to come up who are serving this morning, serving at the table, worship team, and the prayer room, and our hospitality team to get ready. Just so you know, this is what we do during our response time. We always take time to reflect a little bit on what God's been saying, and we do it in a few different ways. One way is we come to the Lord's table. And the table is set for us as a reminder of what Jesus did to overcome the tyranny of the evil one. That he did come, and he came and he died on the cross to take the penalty and debt of our sin to free us from slavery to it. He poured out his blood for us as a way to make a new covenant relationship between us and God. And so we come to this table to eat the bread that represents Jesus' body that took the penalty of our sin on itself. And we drink the juice that represents his blood that made that new relationship for us. And we do that in gratitude for the way that he has saved us and rescued us from the sin and death. So come to the table this morning. As you respond to the Lord, come to the table and receive with gratitude the sacrifice that Jesus made to set you free. Our worship team will also lead us in some songs. You know, we are set free to go and worship the Lord. Sometimes it feels like we're worshiping him in the wilderness, doesn't it? Things are not always good and easy, and sometimes it feels like we're out there in the middle of nowhere. But even there, we can worship our King. So the team will lead us in some songs again that just speak about how great God is and what he's done for us. And invite you to worship along with them as we sing praises to our King. The prayer room is open again this morning. If you have a way that you just need to cry out to God in the midst of the struggle that you're facing, that's what Israel did. They were crying out to God, and God met them in their misery, and he delivered them and brought them to freedom. So in the places you're struggling right now, feel free to go to the prayer room. Tara and Andrew are in there this morning. They would love to pray with you about whatever is going on, and just bring your need to the Lord so you could experience freedom and life in that place. And finally, a little later on, members of our hospitality team will come and receive our morning offering today, which is just a tangible way that we participate in God's kingdom work here at Lakewood and in Prince George. So why don't you stand, church, as we prepare, and come to the table as you're ready. Spend this time responding to the Lord in the way he's inviting you to today.